Here's a little experiment for you to try out at home. These are the coins that are in my pocket today. I've sorted them out by date in ascending order. This is the earliest, these are the latest coins. And it's the sort of frequency distribution you'd expect. I'll show you what they are. These are the 1970 coins, only one of them actually dated 1971. One coin from 1982, one from 1983, 1985, so these are the only coins from the 1980s. Then we got one coin in 1991, one in 1993, two in 1997, one in 1998, and one in the year 2000. And then we go on to the 2000s, 2001, 2002, three coins from 2008, one from 2009, one from 2010, and then this is the present decade. Obviously we're only halfway through it, but you can see there are far more coins from this decade. 2011, three from 2012, one from 2014, and six from the current year. Now, the thing that's really surprised me is the presence of this coin here, which actually dates from the year of decimalisation, 1971, so it's over 40 years old. My intention is to compare these coins with an assortment of pre-decimalisation coinage that I've still got in a jam jar somewhere, and discuss how decimalisation has had a subtle effect really on our perception of the past and history, as well as some other less obvious effects. I was actually 17 years old when decimalisation took place, but I was really struggling to remember exactly how the transition occurred, and inevitably I had to go to Wikipedia to look it up. I can easily remember calculations in the old currency, things like what's a third of a pound. It used to be 6 shillings and 8 pence. How many pennies are there in a shilling? 12, that kind of thing. But I couldn't for the life of me remember exactly how all the old coins disappeared from my pockets and these new ones appeared. And it turns out, I wondered whether there was a sort of slow transition, and in a way there was. The old coins and such as the half crown were withdrawn well before 1971. Things like the 10 shilling note disappeared, and the new 50p coin was introduced before decimalisation day. But in fact there was a very kind of abrupt change where the banks were closed for a few days over the period to allow cheques and so on that were written out in the old currency to be cleared, and then the banks reopened on decimalisation day, I believe, with a lot of these new coins introduced into circulation. And some of the old coins, such as the florin, which is worth 2 shillings, were retained, and the 10 pence, which is this size now, was actually the same size as a 2 shilling piece in the early part of this period. And I'll show you what one of those looked like in a moment. So basically, in a second, I'll lay out my pre-decimalisation coins and show you those. Just before I take these away, one of the other things I wanted to say to you was, apart from the fact that this is a very old coin, and I didn't put this to one side. I've literally just searched my pockets today and found it in my pocket amongst all the others. But it's even stranger that it's still in circulation, because in 1992, at about this time here, the value of copper had increased so much that the face value of the coin, tuppence, is actually less than the metal value of the coin itself. So people cottoned onto this and began to melt the coins down in order to sell the copper and get more. So it was quite a good return on your money to buy up 2p coins and melt them down. Obviously it was illegal, mess around with currency, but that's what people did. So from about this period here, 2p coins, and then later about here somewhere, 1p coins, began to be just steel discs that had a thin copper coating so that they were the same weight, same size and same appearance, but in fact the copper content of these coins is much less than the copper content of, say, that coin there. Just wanted as well to give you some idea of what I mean by perception of history. If you think about the dates on these coins, they have kind of connotations personally in my own sort of personal recollections of what I was doing throughout all these particular years, but also certain historic events that took place in the year. So 1971 I was still at school. I believe Harold Wilson was in government. It might have been Ted Heath, one or the other. They swapped around quite a lot, a bit like Gladstone and Disraeli in a way. 1982, Falklands War. Ken Livingstone was in charge of the GLC. Margaret Thatcher was in power. She abolished the GLC. Meant London was probably the only capital city in the world that didn't have a local government. What else have we got? 1997, this year here, Tony Blair comes to power. 2001, obviously the millennium. 2010, that would be that one there. Coalition government. And current year. Let me show you my pre-decimalisation coins. Compare that. Right, here we are then. It's taken me a bit longer to sort them out than I anticipated, because they were muddled up with all my residues of foreign holidays, spare coins and things, all packed together in one jar. What I've done is sorted them out. Instead of by decade, they're by monarch now. So the oldest back up in the top left-hand corner again. Ignore these four in the bottom left-hand corner there for a moment. They're there for purposes of describing the changeover period. So these 5 coins here, these are all pennies from the reign of Queen Victoria. And I think the thing that you have to really remember is that these coins were all still in currency. They were all still used right up until 1971. So virtually by the time I went to university, all these coins I was still using. A penny would buy you about 4 sweets at the cinema. 6 pennies would get you into the cinema. Penny was about my pocket money at one stage. So it sort of conceals the value of them as well, really. Okay, so from the Queen Victoria's reign, we've got 1887 penny, 1892, 1897, 1899, 1901. Now this is what I mean about the perspective of history. These coins minted during the Boer War. I mean, this one here, during the Empire. I'll show you close-up pictures of them all a little bit later on, but this is just purposes of showing you the distribution at the moment. You probably can't make out on this one. They're so worn. Really, you can tell by their appearance. They're really grubby. When you handle them, you still get that horrible kind of feeling of grubbiness and the number of hands these are passed through. And they're worn down, some pennies, virtually indecipherable. But you can see a very kind of pale portrait of a young Queen Victoria there. And this is in the last year of her reign, the more elderly portrayal of her. Then we've got several coins here from the reign of her son, Edward VII, 2 from 1903, 1904, 2 from 1907, 2 from 1908, and 1 from 1909. And again, they're all pennies. Haven't got any other denomination coin to show you. But when we get on to the reign of Edward's son, George V, got 2 coins from his reign, one from 1914, so start of the First World War. I find it absolutely extraordinary. And this one here dated 1926. This is actually a farthing, so this would be, a penny would be worth 4 of these, so that's a quarter of a penny. Then the next reign here, George VI, who there's a king in between, obviously Edward VIII, between George V and George VI, but he abdicated in the same year as his coronation, so I'm not sure he even was crowned, to be honest. Not sure they had the time to be. But that monarch is missing because his reign was so brief. Went on to become the Duke of Windsor. Right, so George VI, we've got another type of coin here. This is worth threepence. This is the old threepenny Joey, threepenny piece. We've got another farthing here. This is 1937, this is 1943. So this is while the Nazis, Hitler's in power in Germany. This is during the Second World War, as is this one here, 1944 halfpenny. Then we've got another type of coin here. This is this is another type of coin as well. This is a halfpenny, which is half of one of these pennies. Then we've got a shilling here from 1947, and another shilling and a halfpenny from 1948. The shilling is worth 12 pennies. So this is pre-decimalisation, units of currency not divided up decimally. So 20 of these go up to make a pound. 2 of these obviously make a penny. 12 pennies make a shilling. And then this is Elizabeth II, the current monarch. So the 1953 shilling, 1963 2 halfpennies, 1965 we've got 2 halfpennies again, so that's 1 penny. A half a crown, this was withdrawn about this period. This is worth 2 shillings and 6pence. And this one here is a crown. It wasn't actually in use, as that 1965 was the year of Churchill's death, and they minted a commemorative crown which is worth 2 half crowns obviously, so this is worth 5 shillings. This is 2 shillings and 6pence. And then what do we got here? In 1967 we've got 2 pennies and a halfpenny. Okay, that's all my legitimate, as I will describe it, pre-decimal coinage. I've got some others to show you in a moment, which you constantly found in your change, which was pennies minted in Ireland or Gibraltar, the Isle of Man, and it was a disaster when you got them because you could never spend them, but they looked just like this at face value at first glance, but they weren't legitimate coinage in the UK. I'll show you those in a moment. But these 4 here, this is the transition period. So this is dated 1970, so it's just before decimalisation took place, but it's actually described as a 10 pence piece. So it's 10 new pence. And this is the same size as a florin, which unfortunately I haven't got. It was a coin very similar to the half crown, only the same size as this. And that was to ease the transition over, because 10p was worth 2 shillings. So 10 of those was worth 2 shillings. Sorry. Yeah, 24 of those was worth 2 shillings, and 2 shillings was worth 10 new pence. So that was a way of easing people gently into the decimal idea. This little coin here is from 1971, so from the year of decimalisation, and it's half a new p. Because previous to decimalisation people were used to the idea of halfpennies, it was introduced because the new penny, this thing, was worth far less than that. In fact, I don't think it's even worth a half of an old p. So this coin was required at the beginning simply because you needed a coin of small value in your change, otherwise it was just going to bump prices up. And these two coins here are five new pence pieces. They're dated from 1980, so this is nearly a decade after decimalisation has happened. And you can see, if I compare it to that old shilling, that they're worth exactly the same amount, and they're the same shape, so when you feel for them in your pocket and you look at them, they look like and they are the same value. So those 4 coins there intended to kind of ease the transition. There was a very condescending advert on the television at the time called Granny Gets It, or Granny Gets to Know It, or something like that, which was of a young girl teaching her grandmother the new coinage. But for elderly people in particular, it was a huge problem to suddenly sacrifice all these coins that they'd used all their lives and have to spend a new coin. Okay, well, I just described the last lot of coins I showed you as legitimate. These are not illegal coins, but they're kind of extraneous. Let's call them extraneous. At the top here, you've got 9 coins. This one is pre-decimalisation. These 8 are all post-decimalisation. They're all from Eire, all from the Republic of Ireland. It's an independent country, obviously, and their currency isn't linked to ours. And before they joined the euro, for some reason, they always minted their coinage so it looked exactly like ours. And with the constant coming and going of citizens between Ireland and the UK, you ended up with a lot of these coins in circulation. And if you got them, it was just tough, because I suppose you could have taken them to a bank and exchange them at whatever the appropriate exchange rate was, but they weren't legal tender in the UK. So if you were a kid and you got them in your pocket money, or bus conductor gave them to you or something like that, you were just stuffed, basically. Then we got another 2 here, similar kind of thing. This is a 1980 Australia 20 pence, which is exactly the same size as the old florin. It's got the Queen's head on it. You could easily get that and not see the obverse side, which has got some kind of manatee or whatever they call them, dugong or something. So it's clearly not a legitimate UK coin. And this one's from New Zealand. Similar kind of thing, 10p, same size as the old shilling or the new 5p before it went down to that size. And again, just tough luck if you got it. Then we've got another category here. I really don't know what to make of these. I mean, I'm not sure whether you could, a bit like you can spend Bank of Scotland notes, but no one wants them. These are all from various parts of the United Kingdom. These are all from the curiously named Bailiwick of Jersey, so one of the Channel Islands. They're all in that kind of transition period, so you've got to bear in mind people were dealing with coins they weren't familiar with anyway, and then they suddenly get, what have we got there? This is a 1969, so pre-decimalisation, 50 new pence. So in other words, it's in that period when the 50 new pence had replaced the old 10 shilling note, but it's got Bailiwick of Jersey on it. I mean, what are you supposed to do with it if you get it? Is it legitimate currency or not? Obviously at the time I decided not, and just put it in my collection. What else have we got? One coin from Guernsey, which is a 1977 2p. So clearly you had the same problem before and after decimalisation, really. of not always knowing whether coins were legitimate currency. And 3 here from the Isle of Man, which I think it's got its own parliament. So yeah, I'm pretty sure it has. So is it? Are these foreign coins or are they legitimate currency? I just don't know. And the 3 down here, definitely not. This one here looks just like a modern day 50p. It's got the same kind of shape and size as that one, which I know isn't a modern day 50p. And it's actually 5 Hong Kong dollars. So again, it's probably worth more than 50p, but not anymore, obviously, as we gave Hong Kong back to China at the end of the lease. And the other 2 are from another area of contention, Gibraltar. And these confuse me the most, really, because this small one is a 1994 10 pence. And the large one is earlier, and it's a 1988 10 pence. So this one looks like a shilling, which is 5 new pence. This one looks like a florin, which will be 10 new pence. So I would say that one is more understandable during this transition period than this one, but they're actually both worth the same amount of money. So when in doubt, just put it in a jar and forget about it. One other thing that's just struck me as I'm packing all these coins away as well is just the feel of the coins in terms of how valuable they feel. So for instance, here's 12 pence, 12 old pence, that's a shilling, which is 5p in today's terms, one of those. Let me just show you. 5p, same value. Listen to that, a clink of coins, good old-fashioned sound of coins. That really feels like it's worth something, as well as if you probably fell in a river, weight of it would probably drown you as well. Okay, now for this next part, I just wanted to show you the coins in a little bit more detail and discuss their historical context a little bit. This first coin, 1887, to give you an idea, this is the year before Jack the Ripper stalked the streets of the East End. As you can see, it's very worn. Heaven knows how many hands this has passed through. And as I said previously, they really feel grubby, these coins. You constantly want to wash your hands when you handle them. And I can well remember having them in my pocket, and my pocket being full of soiled tissues and so on, because I was always having colds when I was a kid. But in the 19th century, I mean, the hygiene was minimal, and people were, suffering from all kinds of contagious diseases, as well as the fact that, life was just really grimy. And nowadays we fuss so much about handing over coins in shops and the shopkeeper not handling the food and so on, but none of that in the 19th century, let alone when I was a kid. So this was the year in which Conan Doyle published his first Sherlock Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet. That one often crops up in pub quizzes, good to remember. Then we come to 1892, this coin almost as worn as the previous one. The translation of the Latin abbreviations around the perimeter are Victoria, by the grace of God, Queen of Britain and Defender of the Faith. Later coins, as we'll see, had a little bit more detail on them. And 1892 was actually the year that Tchaikovsky premiered the Nutcracker Suite in St. Petersburg in Russia. Next, the coin from 1897. You can see a little bit more detail around the perimeter now of the Latin inscription, which says Victoria, by the grace of God, Queen of Britain, Defender of the Faith, and now they've added Empress of India, Indimp, to her title. In the same year, Bram Stoker publishes Dracula. This is the 1899 coin. Design of the penny doesn't change till the end of the reign of Queen Victoria now. So not much more to say about this one really. 1899 was the year in which the Second Boer War began, which is more commonly referred to as the Boer War. I actually had two ancestors who took part in the war. My grandfather on my mother's side joined the West Surrey Regiment, but she's never mentioned it. I just found that out from a little bit of research, so I don't know whether he actually managed to get to South Africa. And then on my father's side, my great uncle, so his uncle, Robert Astley, he served in the King's Own Royal Regiment, the 4th Regiment of Foot, which was the regiment that my father was later to join. And this photograph is of Baden-Powell, who conducted the defence of Mafeking, which is one of the two towns or cities besieged in the first year of the war, the other one being Ladysmith. I think Kimberley was as well. So this coin, dated 1901, it's taken a bit of a hammering, maybe literally. You do hear stories of boys putting coins onto tram lines to try and flatten them, so maybe something like that happened to this, but there's quite a lot of marks on it. Anyway, 1901 was the year that Edward VII succeeded to the throne, and here he is in all his finery. And the year was also the year that Marconi transmitted the first transatlantic radio message. So here we are at the beginning of the 20th century, and the modern world is beginning to appear. Now we're into the Edwardian era. Edward VII's portrait on the coinage, and first 1903 is the year in which the Wright brothers make their first powered air flight. So the beginnings of the 20th century and the beginnings of the modern age. I'll confess my Republican sympathies at this point. Edward VII is not a monarch I have a great deal of respect for, second only to George IV. This year, 1904, is the year in which the Americans began construction of the Panama Canal, having taken over the work from the French, who gave up on it in the end of the 19th century. And then in 1907 we're heading inexorably towards war. This is the year in which Britain and Russia form an entente, which resulted in there being two power blocks in Europe, the Triple Entente and the Triple Axis. So a system of alliance is set up, which inevitably is going to end in overall European conflict. And 1908 is just one of the years in which the crisis very nearly prompts the Great War, when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina in the Balkans. In Britain, for much of this period, there's a Liberal government in power, a reforming government. In 1909, national old age pension was introduced, and on the international stage, 1909 is also the year that Louis Blériot crossed the English Channel in an airplane. But the storm finally breaks in 1914, the beginning of the First World War. I always wonder when I look at this coin how many hands it passed through and how many of those people died during that conflict. This picture is probably of the arrest of Gavrilo Princips in Sarajevo, the assassin who fired the first shot of the Great War. Then there's a bit of a gap and we come to this George V farthing in 1926. This is the year of the general strike, and in this year my father was 14 years old, had just left school and was working in a coal mine, hewing coal. So he was probably about the age of the young chap on the right there. Of course, he'd only been working a short while when the colliers and the rest of the country went on strike. The miners held out for ages, and the country was riven. This picture really raises my hackles. It's of some people who went out to Oxford University students who went out to break the strike and succeeded. Okay, George VI is now in power following the abdication of Edward VIII in 1936. In Germany, the Nazis are in power. In Spain, the Spanish Civil War is going on. And in this particular year, the Hindenburg crashes in America, having made a transatlantic crossing. This coin in 1943 was minted during the Second World War. 1942 really saw the turning point of the war, with battles in North Africa, El Alamein, the US victory at the Battle of Midway, and the Russians at the Battle of Stalingrad. And here we are with this 1944 halfpenny. 1944, obviously the year of the Normandy invasion and the beginning of the end. This is a photograph of Ord Wingate, because 1944 was also the year of Wingate's second Chindit operation in Burma, Operation Thursday, in which my father took part. So the war came to an end in 1945, and servicemen and women came home, and this is the period of the so-called baby boom. My sister was born in this year. It's also the year of Indian independence, which really marked the end of the British Empire. This is 1948, a halfpenny and a shilling. This is the year that saw the tragedy of Gandhi's assassination. So I've put this particular picture here of Gandhi during a visit to Britain, just to demonstrate that the working classes of Britain at least had a great deal of empathy with him, and vice versa. Now we're into the reign of Elizabeth II. It's also the year of my birth. One of the most notable events of the year was the ascent of Everest by Hillary and Tenzing. And in the Soviet Union, Stalin dies and the Korean War shortly after comes to an end. These are two halfpennies from 1963, which is the year of Kennedy's assassination, of course. We have another pair of 1965 halfpennies, followed by half crown from the same year. Really like half crown coins. And then, of course, 1965, the year of Churchill's death, and this specially minted crown, the Churchill crown. This is a picture of the funeral procession passing through Trafalgar Square. A few coins from 1967. What happened in that year? Well, it was more than 20 years ago today, put it that way. Okay, then just to wrap up this section, some pictures of the new coinage as it was at the start of decimalisation as it is now. Old new 10p below and a new 10p above. And there's this half a new p, which I think was withdrawn about 1984, which was needed because you needed small denominations of coin. And then the old new 5p below and the new 5 new p above. So here we are in 2015, and there are now only 2 non-decimal currencies in the entire world. One of them is this Madagascan Ariary, and the other is the Mauritanian Ukiya. Now, neither of these two currencies are actually in practice non-decimal because the single unit of currency is no longer broken down into non-decimal units, even though in theory it could be. So in practice, the entire world now has a decimal currency system. So you could almost argue that decimal currencies won out in some kind of global Darwinian struggle for the survival of the fittest, but I don't personally think it's really like that. I'm not arguing that we should go back to a non-decimal currency, that would be madness now, but I do think we lost a great deal and gained very little when we changed the system back in 1971. So why did we change? Well, I think, looking back on it now, one of the clear reasons was that in 1972, the year after decimalisation, this Prime Minister, Edward Heath, took us into the common market, and there was a a need for the British economy to conform more closely to that of Europe. But of course, that argument has continued to this day, where we stubbornly cling to imperial measurements for weight and distance. We still stick to pounds and ounces and miles and inches and so on. At the time, that conversation was camouflaged really by the rational argument that 10 is the basic unit of our mental calculations. It's the natural way to count. We have 10 fingers, and that's how we count. Again, is that really the case? I don't think necessarily so. Our language goes up to 12 in terms of scale. We've got words for 11 and for 12, which a lot of the European languages don't have. And yes, I agree, it is much easier to calculate in groups of 10. But culturally, I don't think the British are actually programmed to do so. I mean, in Japan, in the Orient, their mental arithmetic skills are fantastic, but they learn their numeracy in a slightly different way, in a sort of sing-song fashion, and their words for numbers are all based around units of 10, and it's clearly a decimal system suits them perfectly, but I don't think it necessarily does for us. You also have to consider that the correlation between the fact that we've got 10 fingers and that in most languages numerals are categorized into units of 10 could be false. I mean, the reverse logic would be that the ancestors of the English-speaking peoples all had 12 fingers, which may be the case, but I doubt it. And then when it comes to the physical task of dividing objects up rather than the mental task of dividing them, a non-decimal system is much, much easier. I mean, just take a look at this old Spanish dollar. They were deliberately designed to be broken into 8 pieces, hence the expression that you hear pirates spouting pieces of 8, or the parrots anyway. Just think about it. If you wanted to divide this coin into 10 equal parts, it's much, much harder than snap it in 2 and then that piece into 2 again and so on. So you end up with units of 8 rather than units of 10. And I'm sure that's one of the reasons that circular systems such as the rotation of the Earth and so on, we divide up in the same way. That the sun rises and falls in an arc, and it's much easier to judge when it's an eighth of the way or a quarter of the way or a half of the way through the morning than it is to judge when it's a fifth of the way or a tenth of the way, which is why our clocks all show numbers up to 12. The same is true of distance. If you think of something like a piece of string, very difficult to divide it into 5 or 10, but all you've got to do is put the ends together and snip it in half, and then do the same again with those 2 pieces, and you've got divisions of 4, and you can carry on to 8 and 16 and so on. And then with that in mind, just imagine how flexible our old pre-decimal currency really was. I mean, the pound you could divide up into 20 portions. 20 shillings make a pound, but that shilling you could divide up into units of 12 pennies make a shilling. And just think about the number of sort of fractions that you can create out of that system. For instance, if you take the modern pound, try dividing it by every number between 1 and 20. There's only 6 numbers that actually divide into that pound, whereas if you take the old pre-decimal pound, there are 12 numbers, so it's twice as flexible as the modern pound. I mean, for instance, a 15th of a pound is 1 and 4 pence. A 16th of a pound is 1 and 3 pence. You can't do either of those divisions precisely with the modern pound, which is only divisible by 6 numbers, as I say. So over the course of 20 years, we went from the situation where in the 1960s we had this old halfpenny, and the pound could be divided into 480 subunits, to the mid 1980s when this coin, the half new penny, was withdrawn and the pound could only be divided into 100 subunits. So this meant that an item that in 1965 would have cost you 1 shilling and 4 pence, a 15th of a pound, in 1985 the equivalent of that would be 6.66 pence. So the price of it would inevitably be rounded up to 7 pence. And of course, that kind of transaction was going on hundreds of thousands, if not millions of times throughout the economy, and not just for that one sum, but for every sum that required rounding up. One of the themes I wanted to explore on this channel, I'll go into more detail at another time, is complexity theory and how it interacts with our study of history. And briefly, there are two characteristics of complexity theory that interest me with regard to decimalisation. One is that in a complex system such as an economy, a deliberate action can have an effect which is counterintuitive. In other words, the result of the action isn't necessarily the intended result. And the other one is what's commonly referred to as the butterfly effect, that a tiny change in a system can have tremendous results. So for instance, a spark of a flint can ignite an enormous forest fire that spreads across half a continent, or someone sneezing can bring down a tremendous avalanche of snow. So in the mid to late 70s, the UK suffered a devastating inflation that led to all kinds of social and economic problems. And of course, the main and obvious reasons for it were the world crisis in petrol prices and the right-wing governments would have blamed it on trade union demands for higher wages, which in fact were just demands for wages to keep up with the inflation rate. So it was sort of chicken and egg kind of thing. But there is a case to be made for those sort of unintended effects that have arisen out of decimalisation and the inflationary stimulus that gave to the economy. So there are quite a few ways that you can see that decimalisation might have caused inflation. I've already tried to go into the paucity of small denominations of coin and the consequent need to round up the results of division of the pound. But then you've also got this sort of psychological effect of the debasing of the coinage. I mean, here you've got the exact equivalent pre and post decimalisation of 12 pennies being the equivalent of 5 new pence, and just the sight of that makes you think that the left hand side is far more valuable than the right, but in fact they're the equivalent value. So there's far greater tendency now to spend that coin on the right.
Same goes for things like the pound now being a coin rather than a note. Has exactly the same. Advertisers just pick up on it immediately and realise that you're far more likely to take a pound out of your pocket than you are out of your wallet and spend it. Another inflationary pressure that arose out of decimalisation is that millions of pounds were spent actually on the process of decimalising. So, for instance, read recently Woolworths spent £5 million just on converting all their cash registers to a decimal system and training their staff. Now, if you multiply that across the economy as a whole, how many millions of pounds must have been ploughed into the economy? Didn't go on material. It went on kind of immaterial things like training and so on. But all that money went into the economy and then had to be spent. And of course, supply and demand, as the supply of money goes up, its value goes down. So inflation occurs. So this is what I mean about using complexity theory to analyse events in history. You have a situation where businessmen are keen for the UK to join Europe. So as part of that process, we're persuaded to decimalise our coinage, as a result of which there's an inflation. UK goods go up in price and business with Europe suffers. And then on top of that, it's just tiny little incremental increases in price as a result of rounding up the divisions of the pound, and that has a massive effect on inflation, which was in double figures by the end of the 1970s. Okay, now I mentioned much earlier that I'd had difficulties remembering the transition process, how it actually took place between the old and the new coinage, and that I'd had to refer to Wikipedia. And as it happens, two of the other themes that I want to pursue with these series of films is one is memory, and the other is digitization, and how now we're in the digital age, it's changed the way we study history and the way we think about our own history. And two things occurred to me. One was how difficult, well nigh impossible, it would have been for me to research that period and find out exactly what had taken place, and I could just do it with a click of a button nowadays on the internet. But the other thing was, as soon as I'd read this piece in Wikipedia, I suddenly thought, oh yeah, that's it, I remember now. And it occurred to me, in fact, I didn't remember. I got the impression from Wikipedia, which could be, I mean, I'm sure it's an accurate memory, but it's not my memory of it. It's a digital implanted memory. So I realise that sounds a little bit strange, but what I'm trying to say is that we're only really now just beginning to understand exactly how memory works. So we tend to think of our memories as though the brain was making a recording of events as they happen, and that in order to recall something, we simply have to rewind that recording, replay it in order to remember what happened. But that's not actually the case. What's closer to the truth is that 99.9% recurring of things that happen around you, you forget instantly, and things that are less consequential to you, you forget over time, and you're left with some fairly clear memories, plus the fact that you can remember some kind of structure, say in your day-to-day existence, so you will recall what you were doing on a particular day simply because you did it out of habit. So what that means is that it's quite possible for say, two witnesses to the same event to have very genuine but differing memories of what actually took place. And also, if you do have a gap in your memory about something, there's an enormous risk that questioning about it, or particularly suggestive questioning, the way the questioning is worded, or worse than that still, the way, say, a hypnotist will try and regress you back to recall an event that you've forgotten, can result in the memory being suggested to you and implanted there so that you genuinely believe that that memory is accurate. So then if you think of history as a kind of collective memory, the same kind of problem can arise, that unless you actually witnessed an historic event yourself, or even if you did live through it, if you have gaps in your memory, you rely on the historian to fill those gaps. And the minute they do so, it becomes a kind of firm reality for you, whereas in fact it could be fictional. So I'm not suggesting that that's the case with this Wikipedia article. I'm just trying to point out that memory and history are very important to our personal and collective identities, and both can be manipulated. So there we are. I'll leave you with a photograph of my personal favourite, the pre-decimal half crown. I think a lot of people share my fond nostalgia for the pre-decimal currency. I mean, as a schoolboy, it was quite a thrill to take a coin out of your pocket that someone had carried around 100 years before you. I don't think the modern currency has that same kind of character to it. And in no way am I trying to suggest that we go back to these so-called good old days, because let's face it, they were pretty awful. But at the same time, I don't think we should really regard decimalisation through the rosy-tinted spectacles of the modern age, that we paid quite a heavy price for changing our coinage system and didn't get much back in return. I'm going to put this film out as the first in what I hope will be a number of them on a YouTube channel. I hope you've enjoyed it. I promise you I will improve. This is my first attempt. I'm going to get some better software, better equipment and so on, and I've got ideas for a whole series of films that I hope will interest you. So for now, bye.